Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the documented cruelty of the antebellum South collides with something far more disturbing than any textbook dares to record. I'm your host, and this is another exploration into the forgotten corners of our past, where justice denied in life allegedly found its voice in death. Before we descend into this particular darkness, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it there? Are you alone? There's something about these stories that feels different depending on when and where you encounter them. Some of you might be watching in broad daylight, skeptical and curious. Others might be here in the dead hours, when the world feels thinner somehow, when the past doesn't seem quite so distant. Today's case takes us to Natchez, Mississippi, in the sweltering summer of 1858. The United States stands 3 years away from tearing itself apart in civil war. The institution of slavery has reached its most elaborate, most brutal refinement, and in this environment of sanctioned horror, something happened that would challenge even the most rational mind's conception of where the boundaries between life and death truly lie. On August 12, 1858, a 28-year-old enslaved woman named Sarah Bellmont was executed by hanging in the public square of Natchez. The charge was murder by poisoning. The victim was Margaret Thornwood, wife of Colonel Marcus. Thornwood, owner of the Thornwood plantation, one of the most profitable cotton operations in Adams County. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. No defense was permitted. The verdict was never in question. Sarah Bellmont had worked in the Thornwood household since childhood, by all accounts found in surviving letters and diary entries from neighboring plantations. She was literate, unusually so for an enslaved person in that time and place. She spoke with what witnesses described as an unsettling clarity and composure. Even on the scaffold, with the noose already around her neck, she did not weep or beg. Instead, according to the Natchez Daily Courier, dated August 13, 1858, she looked directly at Colonel Thornwood, who stood among the crowd of spectators and spoke words that would be remembered for decades to come. The newspaper's account, written in the casual racism typical of the era, nevertheless preserves her final statement with eerie precision. "You will never sleep alone again, Marcus Thornwood. Every night for as long as you draw breath, I will be beside you. You wanted to possess what you had no right to claim. Now you will have exactly what you desired, forever." The trapdoor opened. Sarah Bellmont died at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon, according to the official execution record held in the Adams County archives. What happened next would transform a brutal historical footnote into something else entirely. Something that courthouse records, personal diaries, medical examinations, and witness testimonies struggled to explain then, and which remains unexplained to this day. Colonel Marcus Thornwood would be dead within 3 months. The official cause of death, recorded by Dr. Alistair Pemberton on November 9, 1858, was listed as heart failure brought on by acute nervous exhaustion. But Dr. Pemberton's private journal, discovered in 1967 when his descendant donated family papers to the Mississippi Department of Archives, and history tells a very different story. A story about a man who appeared to be dying not from any physical ailment, but from something that manifested only in the darkest hours of night. Something that left physical evidence that Dr. Pemberton himself examined and could not rationally explain. This is the documented case of what became known in whispered conversations among both white and black communities in Natchez as the Corpse Mistress. A case where the corpse of an executed woman, allegedly, returned night after night to the bed of the man who ordered her death. Not as a ghost, not as a vision, but as a physical, tangible body that witnesses claim to have seen, touched, and recoiled from in horror. The question we must attempt to answer is not whether this story is comfortable, or whether it fits our modern understanding of possibility. The question is, what actually happened in the Thornwood mansion between August and November of 1858? And why do some residents of Natchez still refuse to speak about Thornwood plantation, even though it was demolished in 1891? To understand the horror that allegedly unfolded at Thornwood plantation, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. Natchez, Mississippi, in 1858, was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the entire United States. Built on the forced labor of thousands of enslaved people, the plantations surrounding the city produced cotton that fed textile mills across the Atlantic. The city itself was a study in contrasts: magnificent antebellum mansions overlooking the Mississippi River, while just miles away, human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The Thornwood plantation encompassed nearly 800 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land. Colonel Marcus Thornwood had inherited the property from his father in 1842 and had expanded operations considerably. Records from the 1850 census show that Thornwood held 127 enslaved people. By 1858, that number had grown to 156. The plantation produced an average of 400 bales of cotton annually, generating enormous wealth for the Thornwood family. Marcus Thornwood himself was, by the standards of his time and place, considered a respectable member of society. He served briefly in the Mexican-American War, which earned him his honorary title of colonel. He was a member of the Natchez Trace Planters Association, a deacon at First Presbyterian Church, and hosted elaborate social gatherings that were described in detail in the Society pages of local newspapers. His wife, Margaret Thornwood, was the daughter of a prominent Charleston shipping merchant. She had married Marcus in 1845, and by all public accounts, they maintained a proper Southern marriage. They had no children, a fact that several contemporary letters hint was a source of private disappointment, though such matters were rarely discussed openly in polite society. Sarah Bellmont's origins are more difficult to trace with precision, as enslaved people were rarely afforded detailed documentation unless they appeared in property inventories or legal proceedings. What we know comes from fragmented sources, estate papers, a few letters, and most significantly, a diary that would not be discovered until 1923. According to plantation records, Sarah was born on Thornwood property in approximately 1830. Her mother's name was listed simply as Amara, with no surname recorded. There is no record of her father, which was tragically common. At age 7, Sarah was moved from field work to the main house, where she began training as a domestic servant. This transition usually indicated that a child showed particular intelligence or capability, traits that would be exploited for household labor. Several letters from Margaret Thornwood to her sister in Charleston make brief mentions of Sarah over the years. An 1852 letter notes, "The girl Sarah has proven quite capable of managing my wardrobe and has a surprising facility with reading, though I cannot determine how she acquired this skill." An 1855 letter mentions, "Sarah continues to serve adequately, though she possesses an unsettling manner of looking at one directly when spoken to, which I find rather bold for her station." This last observation is particularly significant. Enslaved people were systematically trained not to make direct eye contact with white people, especially white women. The fact that Sarah apparently violated this fundamental rule of the slave system suggests a certain fearlessness, or perhaps a deeper defiance that she had learned to mask in other ways. The community of enslaved people at Thornwood Plantation maintained their own social structures, spiritual practices, and oral traditions, largely hidden from the white family that owned them. Recent historical research has revealed that many enslaved communities in the Deep South preserved African spiritual traditions, particularly from Yoruba, Igbo, and Congo belief systems, often concealing these practices beneath a veneer of Christian conversion. One crucial witness to the events that would unfold was Eliza, an enslaved woman approximately 55 years old in 1858, who served as a cook in the Thornwood household. Eliza was illiterate, but her testimony was recorded by two different sources. First, in a deposition taken during the rushed trial of Sarah Bellmont, and second, in an interview conducted in 1876 by a Freedmen's Bureau agent documenting former slave experiences. Both accounts align in most essential details, though the 1876 interview includes information that Eliza would never have dared to speak aloud in 1858. According to these records, Eliza described Sarah as someone who carried the old knowledge, a phrase that appears repeatedly in accounts of enslaved people who maintained African spiritual practices. Eliza claimed that Sarah's grandmother had been brought directly from West Africa in the 1790s and had been a person of spiritual authority in her homeland. This grandmother, whose name was recorded only as Old Amara, allegedly taught certain practices to her daughter and granddaughter before her death in approximately 1848. The nature of these practices would become central to understanding what happened after Sarah's execution. But in the months leading up to that execution, they remained hidden, part of the invisible world that enslaved people maintained parallel to the world their enslavers thought they controlled. Margaret Thornwood fell ill in late July 1858. Her symptoms, as described in letters to her sister and in Dr. Pemberton's medical notes, began with severe stomach cramps, progressed to vomiting, and culminated in convulsions. She died on July 28, 1858, after 5 days of suffering. Dr. Pemberton's official diagnosis was cholera, which was plausible given that there had been several cases in Natchez that summer. However, Colonel Thornwood immediately suspected poisoning. His accusation fell on Sarah Bellmont within hours of his wife's death. The speed of this accusation and the certainty with which it was made would later strike some observers as suspicious. Why would a man so immediately accuse a specific enslaved woman of such a crime unless there was some prior conflict, some previous tension that had already existed? The trial records, such as they are, provide no insight into this question. In the antebellum South, trials of enslaved people accused of crimes against white people were perfunctory affairs. The outcome was predetermined. Sarah was not permitted to speak in her own defense. No evidence of actual poison was presented. The prosecution's case rested entirely on the fact that Sarah had prepared meals for Margaret Thornwood and therefore had opportunity, and on Colonel Thornwood's testimony that he knew with certainty that Sarah was responsible. The jury, composed of 12 white male property owners, deliberated for less than 20 minutes. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 weeks. During those final 2 weeks, Sarah was held in the Adams County Jail. Several people visited her there, including Reverend Josiah Crane, who attempted to secure a confession and a conversion. According to Reverend Crane's own journal, Sarah refused both. She maintained her innocence regarding Margaret Thornwood's death, and she explicitly rejected the Christian salvation he offered, stating that she answered to older powers than his God. This statement appears in multiple sources and seems to have genuinely disturbed Reverend Crane, who wrote that Sarah spoke with an authority that seemed inappropriate, even impossible, for someone in her position. On August 12, 1858, Sarah Bellmont was taken from her cell, transported to the public square, and executed before a crowd estimated at over 300 people. And there, on the scaffold, she spoke the words that would haunt Natchez for generations. The first incident occurred on the night of August 12th, less than 12 hours after Sarah Bellmont's body was cut down from the gallows and buried in the unmarked slave cemetery on the outskirts of Thornwood plantation. According to testimony given by Thornwood's butler, a man named Samuel, who was approximately 40 years old, Colonel Thornwood retired to his bedchamber at approximately 10:12 p.m. The household staff reported hearing nothing unusual until shortly after 2:02 a.m., when they were awakened by screaming from the master bedroom. Samuel's testimony, recorded in a letter written by Dr. Pemberton to a colleague in New Orleans, describes finding Colonel Thornwood standing in the hallway outside his bedroom, in a state of complete shock, unable to form coherent words for several minutes. When the colonel finally calmed enough to speak, he claimed that he had awakened to find someone in his bed beside him. This initial account was dismissed by the household staff as a nightmare, an understandable psychological response to the day's events. Dr. Pemberton was summoned and administered laudanum to help the colonel sleep. The doctor noted in his journal that Colonel Thornwood was profoundly agitated, but showed no signs of fever or physical ailment. The second incident occurred the following night. This time, Colonel Thornwood did not scream. Instead, at approximately 6 a.m., Samuel entered the bedroom to open the curtains and prepare the morning fire, and found Colonel Thornwood sitting in a chair near the window, still dressed in his nightshirt, staring at his bed with an expression that Samuel later described as beyond terror, something more like resignation to damnation. When Samuel approached and asked what was wrong, Colonel Thornwood simply pointed at the bed and said, "She was there. I felt her beside me. Cold. So cold." The bed was empty. The sheets were disturbed, but that could be explained by the colonel's own movements during the night. Samuel later told Eliza that there had been an odor in the room. Something he could not quite identify, but that reminded him of the smell near the slave cemetery on hot days. Dr. Pemberton was summoned again. His journal entry for August 14th notes, "Colonel T is suffering from severe nervous exhaustion, likely guilt-induced hallucinations following the execution. I have recommended that he remove himself from the plantation for a period of weeks, perhaps visit relatives in Vicksburg until his mental state stabilizes. He refuses to leave, insisting that leaving will not matter, she will follow." The third incident was witnessed by multiple people. On the night of August 15th, Colonel Thornwood requested that Reverend Crane stay in the house, sleeping in an adjacent room with the connecting door left open. The colonel also insisted that two of his most trusted enslaved men, Samuel and another man named Thomas, remain in the hallway outside his bedroom throughout the night. At approximately 3 a.m., according to sworn statements later given by Samuel, Thomas and Reverend Crane, a sound emerged from the colonel's bedroom. Reverend Crane described it as something between weeping and a slow, rhythmic breathing, but with a quality that seemed to come from a throat that was no longer fully capable of producing human sound. The three men entered the bedroom immediately. They found Colonel Thornwood in his bed, his eyes open but unseeing, his body rigid. And beside him, according to all three witnesses, there was an indentation in the mattress and bedding, as though someone of considerable weight was lying there. Reverend Crane approached and reached toward the indentation. His account, written in a private letter to the Bishop of Mississippi dated August 20th, 1858, states, "I extended my hand, expecting to encounter nothing, hoping to demonstrate to Colonel Thornwood that his mind was manufacturing these phantoms. Instead, my fingers touched something. The sensation was immediate and unmistakable. Cold flesh, yielding but firm, with the particular texture of skin. I recoiled instantly. I confess to you, Bishop, that I am not certain what I encountered, but I am certain that I encountered something physical." Samuel's account corroborates this. He claimed that he saw the sheets drawn back as though by invisible hands, and that in the dim lamplight he could briefly see an outline, a shape suggesting a human form, before it faded. Thomas's statement is the most disturbing. He claimed that, for just a moment, he saw a face on the pillow, Sarah Bellmont's face, but transformed by death, the neck broken and twisted from the hanging, the eyes open but clouded. Colonel Thornwood did not speak for the remainder of that night. By morning, he was fevered and delirious. Dr. Pemberton ordered him moved to a different bedroom, and the master bedroom was locked and sealed. This solution lasted exactly one night. On August 17th, Colonel Thornwood was found unconscious in the locked master bedroom, though he had been secured in a guest room on the opposite side of the house. No one could explain how he had gotten past the locked door or why he would have wanted to return to that room, given his apparent terror of it. News of these events began to spread beyond Thornwood Plantation. In a small community like Natchez, where everyone knew everyone else's business, such occurrences could not be kept secret for long. The initial response from the white community was dismissive. The colonel was clearly suffering a mental breakdown brought on by guilt or stress, but the enslaved community told a different story among themselves. Eliza, in her 1876 interview, recalled, "We all knew what was happening. Sarah had promised she would return, and she kept her promise. The colonel thought he had power over her body, over her life. Sarah showed him that there are powers beyond what white men understand, powers that don't die just because they kill the body that holds them." By late August, the situation at Thornwood Plantation had deteriorated significantly. Colonel Thornwood rarely left his room during daylight hours. He refused to sleep, staying awake through the nights with multiple lamps burning. When exhaustion finally overtook him, the incidents would repeat, awakening to find something beside him in bed, feeling cold flesh against his own, sometimes seeing a face that should have been buried in the earth but was somehow present in his room. Dr. Pemberton's entries from this period show increasing concern and confusion. On August 24th, he wrote, "I can find no physical ailment to explain Colonel T's decline. His heart is sound, his lungs clear, yet he is wasting away before my eyes as though something is draining the very life from him. He speaks of dreams where he cannot move, where he is held in an embrace that he describes as the grip of death itself. He claims to smell decay, to feel cold hands on his face, to hear whispering in a voice he recognizes. Tell me in the comments, what do you think is really happening at this point? Is this guilt manifesting as psychological breakdown, or is something else occurring? Because what happens next would challenge even the most skeptical witnesses." On August 28, 1858, Dr. Pemberton brought a colleague, Dr. William Hendricks from New Orleans, to examine Colonel Thornwood and provide a second opinion. The two doctors stayed at the plantation that night. What they documented would become one of the most controversial medical records in Mississippi history. Dr. William Hendricks arrived at Thornwood Plantation with a reputation as one of the most rational, scientifically minded physicians in Louisiana. He had studied in Philadelphia and briefly in Paris. He had no patience for superstition and had agreed to examine Colonel Thornwood specifically to debunk what he assumed were exaggerations or hysteria. His report, submitted to the Louisiana Medical Journal in September 1858, but ultimately rejected for publication, still exists in the archives of Tulane University Medical School. It is a remarkable document, written in precise clinical language that barely conceals the author's profound disturbance at what he claims to have observed. The report begins with a standard medical examination. Patient presents with acute insomnia, significant weight loss, approximately 15 pounds over 3 weeks, tremors in the extremities, and dilated pupils suggesting extreme stress. Physical examination reveals bruising on the torso and arms, which patient attributes to nighttime incidents he cannot fully recall. Bruising patterns are inconsistent with self-inflicted injury or accidental causes. Dr. Hendricks noted that the bruises appeared as finger marks, specifically consistent with someone gripping Colonel Thornwood's arms and chest. When asked how he received these marks, the colonel could only say that, "She holds me, she will not let me go." Both doctors decided to remain in the house that night, with Dr. Hendricks positioned in Colonel Thornwood's bedroom and Dr. Pemberton in the adjacent room. They brought extensive notes and planned to document whatever occurred with scientific precision. Dr. Hendricks's report continues. At approximately 1:45 a.m., I observed the patient, who had been lying rigid and awake despite administered sedatives, suddenly relax into what appeared to be natural sleep. The room temperature, which I had been monitoring, dropped noticeably. I cannot provide an exact measurement as I had no thermometer, but the change was sufficient to make my breath visible in the lamplight. At approximately 2:10 a.m., I observed movement in the bedding beside the patient. The mattress appeared to compress as though under weight. The sheets drew back without any visible cause. I immediately approached the bed to investigate. What followed challenges my ability to describe in clinical terms. The patient's body was pushed to one side of the bed by what I can only describe as an invisible but physical force. I observed the impression of a human form in the mattress, clear and distinct. I placed my hand toward this impression and encountered resistance, something solid but cold, far colder than any living human body. The patient awoke at this moment, or appeared to awaken, though his eyes had an unfocused quality, suggesting a state between sleep and waking. He turned toward the invisible presence and appeared to be held in place by it. I distinctly observed his nightshirt being grasped and pulled, the fabric bunching as though in someone's grip. The patient's arms were forced to his sides. He began to make sounds of distress, but seemed unable to fully cry out. Dr. Pemberton, hearing the commotion, entered the room. His journal provides a corroborating account. Hendricks was standing beside the bed, his face drained of all color. Colonel Thornwood was being held down by some force we could not see, but could clearly observe in its effects. The bedding was moving, wrapping around him. And then, God help me, I saw what Hendricks later confirmed he also saw. A shadow on the pillow beside the colonel's head, a shadow that had shape and depth, despite no visible form casting it. Both doctors attempted to intervene physically, pulling at the bedding, trying to help Colonel Thornwood sit up. They reported encountering resistance, as though someone was fighting against them. The struggle lasted approximately 2 minutes, according to Dr. Hendricks's pocket watch. Then suddenly, whatever presence was there seemed to withdraw. The room temperature normalized. The bedding fell flat. Colonel Thornwood collapsed into unconsciousness. When he revived an hour later, he had no memory of the incident, but bore fresh bruises around his throat and chest. Dr. Hendricks's report concludes, I cannot provide a rational explanation for what Dr. Pemberton and I observed. I have attempted to formulate theories involving mass hysteria, environmental factors, or unknown physical phenomena. None are adequate. Something occurred in that room that defies current medical and scientific understanding. I can only report what I observed with my own senses and what Dr. Pemberton independently corroborated. Reverend Josiah Crane, faced with a situation his prayers alone seemed unable to address, sent urgent letters to the Episcopal Diocese requesting guidance and assistance. On September 3, 1858, Bishop Charles Todd arrived at Thornwood Plantation, accompanied by 2 other ministers. Bishop Todd's approach was methodical. He first interviewed everyone in the household, taking detailed statements. He examined the master bedroom thoroughly in daylight, searching for any natural explanation. Drafts that might cause movement, hidden spaces where someone could conceal themselves, anything that could account for the phenomena being reported. He found nothing suspicious. In a letter to the presiding bishop, he wrote, "The room is well constructed, with no hidden passages or unusual features. I can detect no mechanical trickery, no evidence of conspiracy or deception by the household staff. Yet the testimony is consistent across multiple witnesses, including 2 physicians of sound reputation. The exorcism was conducted on the night of September 4th. The ritual, based on Episcopal traditions, involved prayers, holy water, consecration of the room, and scriptural readings. Bishop Todd, Reverend Crane, and the 2 assisting ministers maintained vigil throughout the night. According to their collective report, nothing occurred until approximately 3 a.m. Then, as Bishop Todd was reading from the Gospel of John, all 4 clergymen reported hearing a sound they described as laughter, low and feminine, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The room grew cold, the lamps flickered despite no wind. And then, Bishop Todd reported, he saw something that shook his faith to its foundations. The clear impression of a woman's form appearing on the bed, visible only for a moment, but distinct enough that all 4 men gasped simultaneously. Bishop Todd shouted prayers of banishment. The form seemed to solidify briefly, and in that instant, the bishop later wrote, he saw Sarah Bellmont's face but transformed. Her expression was not of malice, but of implacable determination, as though she was bound to this place by will stronger than any prayer I could offer, and her eyes, though clouded by death, were fixed on the doorway where Colonel Thornwood stood watching, and in those eyes was the promise of eternity. The exorcism failed. The phenomena continued. On September 10, 1858, a group of enslaved men were ordered to exhume Sarah Bellmont's body from the slave cemetery. The idea, proposed by Dr. Pemberton, was that if the body were moved to consecrated ground in the White Cemetery, or perhaps burned, the spiritual disturbances might cease. What they found when they opened the grave became the subject of terrified whispers throughout Natchez. The grave was empty, not disturbed by animals or grave robbers, simply empty. The rough wooden coffin was still sealed, the earth above it undisturbed, but inside there was nothing. No body, no bones, no remains of any kind. Samuel, who was part of the exhumation team, later stated, "The coffin looked like it had never held anything. It was clean inside, no decay, no smell. Just empty wood. But we had all seen her body placed in there. We had all been at the burial. Where did she go?" This discovery caused panic in the enslaved community. Eliza recalled, "Everyone knew then that Sarah had truly become something else, something between the world of the living and the dead. The old people said she had walked the crossroads, made the journey that some who carry the old knowledge can make. She had transformed." Colonel Thornwood's response to learning that the grave was empty was documented by Dr. Pemberton. He laughed. "When I told him a sound without any humor, he said, 'Of course she's not there. She is here. She has always been here, every night, and she will be here forever.'" In the chaos following the empty grave's discovery, a search of Sarah's former quarters in the slave cabins revealed a hidden diary. The discovery was made by Eliza, who later claimed she knew exactly where to look because Sarah had once shown her the hiding place. The diary, written in clear, educated handwriting, covered approximately 18 months before Sarah's execution. Much of it dealt with daily life, observations about weather, work, small conflicts, and alliances among the enslaved community. But interspersed throughout were passages that suggested Sarah had been preparing for something. One entry from March 1858 read, "Grandmother's teachings become clear to me now. The body is only a vessel. When the vessel is broken by violence, the spirit can be bound to purpose if the will is strong enough. Those who think death ends power understand nothing. Death can be the beginning of power if one knows the way. Another entry from June 1858. He believes he owns everything, my labor, my body, my very breath. He does not understand that some things cannot be owned, only borrowed. And when the borrowing is done, the debt comes due. A particularly chilling entry from July 15th, less than 2 weeks before Margaret Thornwood's death. The symbols are drawn beneath the floorboards where no one will find them until it is too late to matter. The offerings are made. The crossroads have been walked. When the time comes, I will not be afraid. Fear is for those who believe death is an ending. I know it is a doorway, and I know which direction I will walk when I pass through it. The diary also contained drawings, symbols that resembled nothing in any Christian or mainstream spiritual tradition familiar to those who examined it. Years later, these symbols would be identified by anthropologists as variations on Yoruba spiritual markings, specifically those associated with communication between the living and dead. The final entry in the diary was dated August 11th, 1858, the day before Sarah's execution. Tomorrow I will die in their way. Tomorrow night I will live in mine. He wanted to possess me. He will have his desire forever. When this diary was shown to Colonel Thornwood, he reportedly wept, whether from guilt, fear, or some other emotion witnesses could not determine. But from that day forward, he stopped attempting to resist whatever was happening to him. He stopped calling for doctors or ministers. He simply waited. The immediate horror of 1858 eventually gave way to legend, but the legend was periodically refreshed by new discoveries and testimonies that emerged over the following decades. In 1923, a professor of anthropology from the University of Chicago named Dr. Martin Ashford was conducting research into African spiritual traditions preserved in former slave communities throughout the Deep South. While interviewing elderly African Americans in the Natchez area, he was repeatedly directed toward the abandoned remains of Thornwood plantation. The property had been sold several times after Colonel Thornwood's death, but no family ever remained there for more than a few months. By 1891, it was abandoned entirely. The main house had partially collapsed, victim to time, weather, and deliberate vandalism by locals who considered the place cursed. Dr. Ashford's field notes, preserved in the University of Chicago archives, describe his exploration of the ruins. In the remains of what had been the master bedroom, beneath rotted floorboards, he discovered a series of objects that he initially believed to be archaeological curiosities, but which his informants immediately recognized as spiritually significant. The objects included small cloth bundles containing hair, fingernail clippings, and what appeared to be dried herbs, several iron nails that had been bent into specific shapes, fragments of pottery inscribed with symbols matching those in Sarah Bellmont's diary, and most disturbing, a piece of rope that local informants claimed was a section of the actual noose used to hang Sarah. Dr. Ashford photographed these items and documented their positions. His notes indicate that they had been arranged in a specific pattern beneath the floorboards, directly under where the bed would have stood. One of his informants, an elderly woman named Patience, who claimed to be a distant relative of Eliza, explained the significance. According to Patience, Sarah had created what she called a binding circle, a spiritual construct that would anchor her essence to a specific location and purpose even after death. The personal items, the hair and nails, would have been taken from Colonel Thornwood without his knowledge, probably collected during Sarah's work in his room. These created a spiritual connection. The iron, shaped into specific forms, acted as anchors for the spirit world. The inscribed pottery fragments were prayers or invocations in a tradition that predated slavery, brought from West Africa and preserved through oral tradition. She built her own doorway, patients told Dr. Ashford. When they killed her body, her spirit knew exactly where to go and what to do when it got there. That's the old knowledge, the deep knowledge. Most folks lost it or were too afraid to use it. But Sarah, she remembered, and she had the will. Dr. Ashford attempted to remove these objects for further study. According to his notes, that night in his hotel room in Natchez, he experienced vivid nightmares of being strangled. He awoke with bruises around his throat that he could not explain. The next morning, he returned the objects to where he had found them and immediately left Mississippi. His published paper on African spiritual retention made no mention of Thornwood plantation or Sarah Bellmont. In 1965, during the civil rights movement, a young historian named James Baldwin, no relation to the famous writer, was documenting formerly enslaved people's descendants for an oral history project. He interviewed several elderly individuals in the Natchez area whose grandparents had been enslaved at Thornwood plantation. One interview with a man named Isaiah Washington provided disturbing continuity to the story. Isaiah's grandfather had been Thomas, one of the men who witnessed the phenomena in Colonel Thornwood's bedroom in 1858. Thomas had told his grandson detailed stories about those nights, stories that Isaiah had initially dismissed as exaggerations or ghost stories. But Isaiah added something new. He claimed that his grandfather had told him about Colonel Thornwood's final night. On November 9, 1858, Thomas had been summoned to the master bedroom by Dr. Pemberton. They found Colonel Thornwood in his bed, dead. But the circumstances of his death were what Thomas never forgot. Granddaddy said the colonel was lying on his back, his arms at his sides, like someone had positioned him that way. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. And his face, Granddaddy said his face looked like he'd seen something that broke his mind before it stopped his heart. But here's the part Granddaddy never told, except at the very end of his life. There were 2 depressions in that bed. 2 bodies worth of weight in that mattress. The colonel and something beside him. And the sheets on that side were drawn, up like someone was lying there under them. Dr. Pemberton had ordered everyone out of the room while he examined the body. When Thomas returned to help prepare the corpse for burial, the 2nd depression was gone. The sheets were flat. Dr. Pemberton never spoke of what he had seen or done in that room during those private minutes. Granddaddy believed that Dr. Pemberton saw her there, Isaiah said, saw Sarah Bellmont's body lying beside the colonel, solid and real. And that the doctor did something, said something, maybe prayed or maybe just asked her to please let it be done now, because she got what she wanted. She kept her promise. And after the colonel died, nobody ever reported seeing her again. Not in that house, not anywhere, like she was finally satisfied. In 1982, a photographer named Linda Chen was working on a documentary project about abandoned antebellum plantations. She obtained permission to photograph the Thornwood property, though the current landowner warned her that locals avoided the place and that she should not go alone. Chen ignored the warning. She spent an afternoon photographing the ruins, which by then had deteriorated to little more than a foundation and a few standing walls. When she developed her photographs, she discovered anomalies in several frames. In one photograph of what had been the master bedroom, a distinct shadow appears in the shape of a human figure, though Chen insists she was alone and took the photo in bright afternoon sunlight. The shadow shows clear detail. The silhouette of a woman in period dress, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, consistent with a hanging victim. Chen submitted this photograph to several experts in photographic analysis. None could explain the shadow as a result of normal lighting conditions, lens flare, or development errors. The photograph was published in a 1983 book about southern hauntings, where it attracted significant attention. Chen herself refused to return to the property. In an interview, she stated, "I felt something there. I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but I felt watched the entire time I was on that property. Not threatened exactly, but observed, evaluated, like something was deciding whether I belonged there or not. When I saw that shadow in the photograph, I knew I had been in the presence of something that was still very much aware, very much present, even after more than a century." The Thornwood property changed hands several more times. Through the 1980s and 1990s, plans to develop it into a historical site or tourist attraction repeatedly failed. Workers reported feeling uncomfortable on the land. Some claimed to experience nightmares after visiting. Others simply refused to work there without offering specific reasons. In 2003, the property was purchased by a preservation society with intentions of conducting archaeological surveys. The project was abandoned after 3 months when several team members independently reported feeling physically ill while working on the site, particularly near the foundation of the main house. To this day, the Thornwood property sits undeveloped. The ruins have been largely reclaimed by vegetation. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to visit at night, though few actually do, and those who do rarely stay long. And in the African-American community of Natchez, Sarah Bellmont is not remembered as a victim or a ghost story. She is remembered as someone who understood that power can take many forms, and that justice, denied in life, can be claimed in death if the will is strong enough and the knowledge runs deep enough. So we return to the question that opened this investigation. What really happened at Thornwood Plantation between August and November of 1858? We have examined the documentation. Court records confirm Sarah Bellmont's trial and execution. Multiple witness testimonies, recorded contemporaneously and corroborated by several sources, describe phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Medical reports from 2 trained physicians document physical evidence they could not rationally account for. An empty grave, a diary suggesting premeditation of something that should be impossible, and periodic rediscoveries over more than a century that keep the story alive. 3 theories have been proposed to explain these events, and none of them is entirely satisfactory. The first theory is psychological, that Colonel Thornwood experienced a severe mental breakdown driven by guilt over Sarah's execution, and that this breakdown manifested in vivid hallucinations that he convinced others to share through suggestion and mass hysteria. This theory accounts for some elements, particularly the Colonel's deterioration, but it struggles to explain the physical evidence documented by skeptical observers like Dr. Hendricks, the empty grave, or the artifacts discovered beneath the floorboards decades later. It certainly cannot explain photographic anomalies captured more than a century after the original events. The second theory is supernatural, but focused on guilt, that Colonel Thornwood's guilt was so profound that it created a kind of psychic resonance, a spiritual echo that became self-sustaining. This theory suggests that Sarah herself might not have returned, but that the Colonel's conscience created a manifestation that appeared real enough to affect physical matter. This is an interesting psychological spiritual hybrid theory, but it requires accepting that human guilt can literally reshape reality, which is a considerable leap. The third theory is the one that Sarah's own diary and the testimony of those who knew the spiritual traditions seem to support, that Sarah Bellmont deliberately used preserved African spiritual practices to bind her essence to Thornwood Plantation, and specifically to Colonel Thornwood himself. That she prepared for her own death by creating spiritual anchors that would allow her consciousness, or some aspect of it, to remain active after her physical death. That she kept her promise, literally, by returning night after night until Colonel Thornwood died, not as a ghost in the traditional sense, but as something more complex, something that could interact with physical reality because it had been carefully prepared to do so. This theory asks us to accept that reality is more flexible than our current scientific understanding acknowledges. It asks us to consider that spiritual traditions preserved from pre-colonial Africa might contain practical knowledge about consciousness, death, and the boundaries between physical and non-physical existence. It asks us to believe that will, properly directed and supported by specific practices, can transcend death. Which theory is correct, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that the documentation exists, spread across archives, private collections, oral histories, and occasional physical evidence. The story of Sarah Bellmont and Colonel Thornwood is not a modern invention or an internet creepypasta. It is a narrative with roots in verified historical events, even if the supernatural elements remain unverifiable by conventional means. What we can say with certainty is this: Sarah Bellmont was executed for a crime she may or may not have committed by a legal system that denied her any possibility of justice. Colonel Marcus Thornwood died 3 months later under circumstances that terrified witnesses and baffled physicians. The connection between these two deaths has been the subject of testimony, investigation, and speculation for over 160 years. And to this day, the land where Thornwood Plantation once stood remains a place that people instinctively avoid. Whether that avoidance is based on justified supernatural fear or simply the psychological weight of knowing what happened there, the effect is the same. The story will not die. Like Sarah Bellmont herself, it refuses to be buried and forgotten. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this case. Not whether spirits can return from death, but that some injustices create ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment. That cruelty can echo through generations. That the enslaved people who suffered under the plantation system possessed knowledge, power, and agency that their enslavers never acknowledged and never understood. Sarah Bellmont promised that Marcus Thornwood would never sleep alone again. By all accounts, he never did. And perhaps, in some sense, he never will. Perhaps none of us will, as long as we remember what was done in places like Thornwood Plantation, and as long as we understand that some debts transcend death itself. Tell us in the comments, what do you believe happened? Do you think Sarah Bellmont truly returned from death, or is there another explanation? Have you ever experienced something that made you question the boundaries between life and death? If this story resonated with you, or disturbed you, or made you think differently about the hidden histories of the antebellum South, consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community of investigators into the unknown. Ring the notification bell to be alerted when we explore our next case from the shadows of history. Until then, remember, some stories refuse to end, some voices refuse to be silenced, and some promises are kept even beyond the grave. Thank you for joining me on this journey into darkness. I'll see you in the next investigation.